Since I started this series, I have had some pretty exciting offers to visit some very cool places and film some amazing things. But the moment I realized I had made it was when I got an email from the UK government inviting me to visit a sewage works on the outskirts of Birmingham. It smells quite bad. We'll get to why that happened later on. But first, wet wipes are often sold as flushable in the UK, but you're not actually supposed to flush them. The water industry says they won't break apart in the sewers, and they'll end up glomming together with loads of fats, oils and greases to form these gigantic fatbergs which clog up the entire sewer and cost a lot of money to remove. But a few years ago it seemed like we'd solved this problem. In 2019 the water industry came out with the fine to flush standard. So if you see this label on some wet wipes, it means that they've passed all of the water industry's tests and they will break down if you flush them down the toilet. But that label's not on the packaging anymore. You won't find it in the shops. And that's because in 2024, the fine to flush scheme was shut down and the official advice went back to saying that you should never ever flush wet wipes. So what happened there? Did they somehow mess up and say that those wipes were fine to flush when actually they weren't? Or did we invent truly flushable wet wipes and then for some reason uninvent them? We're going to do an experiment. I suppose first, should we just do some toilet paper? So this should break down pretty easily. I'm going to swish it about. How did my life get to this point? I mean, that only took a few seconds, really. So that is totally broken down. Now let's try it with a wet wipe. I've been going at this for a full minute, and I've given it everything I got, and there's just absolutely nothing happening. That's still completely one piece. So this is why historically the advice was always to not flush these things. But then in 2019, the water industry came out with the fine to flush standard. Basically, they connected a toilet to a 20-meter drain line and then flushed some wipes down it and had a look at whether the wipes even made it through the drain line. And if they did make it, how much did they disintegrate? If they did well, the wipes will be certified to water industry standard 40206 and they would get to put the fine to flush badge on their packaging. The water companies even did demonstrations at the time showing how these new wipes performed very differently in the kind of test I was just doing. Obviously this doesn't confirm that a wipe is fine to flush compliant, but it certainly shows you the difference with a wipe that has been certified. I read about this standard at the time and I thought it sounded pretty great because I just love when we can just solve problems like this, come up with better ways of doing things. But the problem was that it was a voluntary standard, so if the wipe manufacturers didn't get on board, nothing was actually going to change. And I looked into it and noticed that Andrex was still selling their wipes as flushable even though they weren't fine to flush. So in 2019, I complained to the Advertising Standards Authority and they agreed with me and they ordered Andrex to stop using the term flushable. That was me. I made that happen. I'm the one person who complained. A few months later, Andrex did receive fine to flush certification and so did more than 100 other products, but then it just stopped. The government at the time wrote to wet wipe manufacturers urging them to stop selling their products as flushable, and in response, the water industry ended the fine to flush scheme, and the focus shifted to a campaign called Bin the Wipe. I've always wondered what happened, and I was actually already thinking of making a video about it when I got an email from Deborah. I got an email from DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, asking if I wanted to visit a sewage works so I could see what happens to wet wipes when you flush them down the toilet. I guess they didn't know that I already know a fair bit about this, but I said, yeah, absolutely. The reason that they wanted me to visit a sewage works was because the government is bringing in a ban on plastic wet wipes, and that should help with keeping microplastics out of the environment. By the way, if that's something that you feel passionately about, then you may be interested in Planet Wild and their recent mission fighting ocean plastic. I've partnered with Planet Wild for this advert, and they're basically a bit like crowdfunding, but for nature. Every month, their community of over 17,000 members funds new environmental missions to protect endangered species, clean up the oceans, or restore forests. They then film these missions and put them on YouTube so you can see what they've been up to and the difference the community contributions are making. For example, in this video, you're able to see how they fought ocean plastic pollution in Albania. To make a difference with Planet Wild, you can give whatever amount feels right for you. And guess what? If you're one of the first 100 people to sign up using my code SPARGO12, I'll pay for your first month. Don't worry, I'm feeling generous, it's on me. Just scan the QR code or click the link in the description and enjoy. You can cancel anytime. Once you've joined, you'll be able to see the difference you're helping to make within the next 30 days on the Planet Wild YouTube channel. If you want to see them in action, check out their mission fighting ocean plastic pollution. So, I got to the sewage works. I don't think anyone spotted this, but you can see me in some of the videos from the other people who were there.
Yep, that's me.
Anyway, we all met at Birmingham New Street Station and we got a taxi to Minworth Sewage Treatment Works, which is a place I would describe as pungent. And then they started showing us around. The first thing they did was they took us to this big thing that kind of looked like a really fast-flowing brown canal, and they said, yeah, that's all of Birmingham's sewage coming through there. And it just went downhill from there, really. They showed us the machines that pick things out of the sewage. So this is where wet wipes would get picked up if they haven't already got stuck at an earlier stage and formed a fatberg. And they showed us this huge pile of stuff that they'd pulled out of the sewage, including this very non-flushable wet wipe, which they showed us was very hard to physically pull apart. So it's obviously not going to break down in the water. But the reason they were showing us all of this is because the government is bringing in a ban on plastic wet wipes, and to mark the occasion they wanted to get the message out that you shouldn't flush wet wipes down the toilet, which I couldn't really get my head around, because it just seemed like they were saying, look at this, people are flushing wipes, it's causing massive problems, but with our new ban on plastic wet wipes, actually this will continue to be a problem. Now, the previous government commissioned some research when they started to put this policy together, and the researchers took a load of different types of wet wipes and tested them to see what actually happens if you flush them down the toilet. Will they break apart in the sewers? And they found that all of the plastic wet wipes that they tested failed the tests, but so did a lot of the non-plastic ones. So the plastic wipe ban is not expected to significantly reduce sewer blockages. In fact, before the government does something like this, they have to do what's called an impact assessment, where they look at all of the different options for how they could deal with a particular problem and explain why they've decided to deal with it in this way. So I had a read of the impact assessment for the plastic wipe ban, and it says that the main reason they're doing it is to help with the issue of microplastic pollution. Plastic wipes, if left to their own devices, will break down into microplastics. And apparently, if you flush them down the toilet, the sewage works can remove about 99% of those microplastics, but that still means there's 1% that is getting through. And also, people just litter them everywhere and they end up breaking down into microplastics that way. So this is all bad stuff and well worth getting rid of. But the impact assessment also says that one of the potential risks of this ban is that people might get confused and think that now that plastic wipes have been banned, it's okay to start flushing wipes down the toilet. And I think this is why they invited me to the sewage works. They want to make sure people know that yes, plastic wipes are going away, but non-plastic wipes can still cause problems and you still shouldn't flush them.
All this stuff is plastic, really. All these wipes, all the sanitary products, they're pretty much plastic based. We're really supporting the ban on plastics, but we still think that the best way to prevent it all in the first place is to only flush the 3 Ps. It's as simple as that: pee, paper, poo.
So I suppose that's it. The research clearly shows that if you flush wet wipes down the toilet, they won't break apart. So the fine to flush standard must have been a mistake somehow. Some of the wipes they tested did break apart though. I wonder what they said about those. Only 4 of the samples tested passed all the tests, and these were those that had previously been certified to WIS 40206 and the packaging was marked with the fine to flush mark. What? So they were fine to flush? I spoke to some people at Minworth about this and I've looked into it a little bit afterwards, and this is what I've learned. First of all, were fine to flush wipes genuinely fine to flush? Generally the answer seems to be yes.
They were very, very easy to break down in under sewer conditions. Didn't contain any plastic, so it seemed like a great thing, and at the time it probably was. I think there was an element of confusion around some customers, which wipe to flush, which we can't flush, And so I think the simple thing to do was, and the decision was made to just say, look, let's throw every wipe in the bin, don't flush any wipe. But I think that's the simplest way forward.
The message was too complicated. Most people have lives. They're not sitting around reading wet wipe packaging, and they're certainly not sitting around watching YouTube videos like this one. Now you might say that in that case what they should do is make the fine to flush standard mandatory for all wet wipes. But I was told that you can't really do that because there are types of wet wipes like medical wipes, floor wipes, makeup wipes, where they have to be a bit tougher and stronger because they're designed for heavier duty scrubbing. So the government decided that if you can't get rid of those wet wipes, and if you can't convince people to only flush some types of wipes and not flush others, the only thing you can really do is make the message simpler, and that is to say, don't flush wet wipes at all. But you can't really do that if you're also saying that certain wipes are fine to flush. So for the sake of simple and clear public messaging, fine to flush had to go. The weird thing is that the standard still exists, but now you just can't really tell whether a brand is complying with it or not. Like Andrex, for example, still sells their wipes as flushable, but does that mean that they actually comply with water industry standards, or does it just mean that Andrex reckons it's flushable. I did test a wet wipe brand that I believed may still be complying with the fine to flush standard, and it did break down pretty much like toilet paper would. But I'm not going to say which brand it was because, first of all, just because it breaks down in a glass doesn't necessarily confirm that it's compliant with the fine to flush standard. And secondly, even if it is, they could change that next week and you wouldn't know because there's no indication on the packaging anymore. So I guess after all this, you really do have to bin wet wipes now because you can't really tell whether they're fine to flush or not. Anyway, this is my last video before Christmas, so I will leave you with some more festive footage from Minworth Sewage Treatment Works. And by the way, I don't know if you noticed, this reflection, which is a little bit weird, kind of looks like some blankets, maybe? If you want to know why that is, and you want to know about the Hollywood magic behind this video, I made a little bonus video on my Patreon all about that. But anyway, Merry Christmas.